Attention, you're listening to The Todd Huff Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk and education. Be advised, the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. And now, coming to you from the Full Suite Wealth Studios, here's your conservative but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Well, that is right, my friends, and you are welcome here joining the Todd Huff Show. It is my pleasure, distinct honor to be here with you today. Email address todd@toddhuffshow.com. You can send your thoughts, questions, opinions, feedback. Always be sure to include the appropriate amounts of adoration and praise, which, as I've said before, is probably 10 to 15% more than you might first think is necessary. I'm kidding, but just a little, my friends. It's good to be here. You know, the White House, this is where we're headed today. The White House late last week announced issued a proclamation announcing Anti Communism Week. And I thought we'd spend some time talking about this because there are people in this country. There's a political movement that is growing, that is very sympathetic at the least, and very pro-communism at its worst. And we want to address this. In fact, we had Zohran Mamdani win the mayoral race in the city of New York. And we have people who just don't have an understanding at all. And I want to talk about this today. I think this is quite important. I think it's quite interesting to discuss. And, you know, I always try to use the current events of the day kind of as a springboard to get into, I think, what I consider the more important fundamental, foundations of worldview and ideology, because that is what shapes the way that people think about politics, about what our government needs to be doing. And that oftentimes puts them either in alignment with, but more times than not, puts them really in opposition, direct opposition to what our founders pieced together here in this great nation when they framed this country, when they wrote our founding document. So that's where we're going to head today, my friends. And as always, you can share your thoughts and opinions, questions. I'll take those. You can do those through the website as well at toddhuffshow.com. But friends, let's be honest. When your financial world starts getting a little more complicated, you need more than just one-size-fits-all advice. That's where Full Suite Wealth makes a huge difference, and they can shine and help you in very, very positive ways. Their team is specialized in working with families and individuals who are at your level, offering personalized guidance that goes far beyond the basics. From private equity to private credit to option strategies, coordinated legal planning, Full Suite Wealth helps you see the big picture and make confident decisions about your legacy. It's all about having a team, by the way, led by Jason, to guide you every step of the way so that you can focus on what matters most, your family, your goals, your future. If you want real confidence in your financial life, check out Full Suite Wealth. FullSuiteWealth.com. That's FullSuiteWealth.com. Build your legacy. Secure your future. I mentioned here that the White House issued a proclamation saying that on November 7th, so that was late last week, that would have been Friday, saying that it's Anti-Communism Week and that they're going to commemorate the approximately 100 million people who lost their lives under communist regimes in the 20th century. And let's pause there for a moment. Let's think about that for just a moment. Communism in the 20th century is responsible for killing almost 100 million people. This is mind-boggling. This is government executing, killing its own people. This, by the way, is not the same thing as someone who has committed a heinous crime, someone who's committed a violent crime, taken the life of another individual, for example, and that person being executed. And even if that was what these numbers represented, we would surely agree that that's a lot of people to even execute, even if it's justified, in the form of capital punishment for murder and violent crimes. 100 million people. That is not quite, but getting close to a third of the population of this great nation. 100 million people. Now remember, how did we get there? This is the thing that I want to hit on, because this is what I see a lot of people, Rush would call them low information voters, but a lot of people pay attention to what politicians say, and they don't really connect the dots or pay much attention to what they do. And it is unbelievable to me that an adult would think that way. When I was a kid, I remember I blew my first knee, and I was, 15 or 16 years old? I think I was 16. In my junior year of football, I must have been 16. And I tore an ACL and some cartilage, and I had surgery. I actually had two surgeries. Back in those days, the surgery has come so far. Now I think a lot of it can be done through the arthroscopic tools. But back when I had the surgery, I had arthroscopic surgery. The doctor wanted to look in and see the knee via the scope so that he could see the damage. Also, he knew I had cartilage he needed to clean up. So he cleaned up the cartilage. He could see that the ACL was torn, and then we scheduled another surgery, I think just a couple of weeks later. That's where I have the longer scar. They opened me up. They rebuilt, I guess, the ACL. That was a rough surgery back in those days, but it's come a long way. But I remember here when I had gotten surgery, people sent me gifts, and people would give me books and different things. And I remember getting a book of quotes. In fact, I'd like to find that book of quotes. I used to read that a lot. When you're stuck in recovery, your options are limited, and reading, not that there's anything wrong with reading, but as a 16-year-old, I wasn't an avid reader like maybe I like to read today. But when you're on your back and you can't do much, in fact, the machine, after surgery, they put me on a machine called it was called the CPM. I don't know what it stood for, constant something motion or something, but basically you were flat on your back and your knee was being bent probably 23 hours a day. And then the other time you were basically doing exercises or, getting up to go to the restroom or whatever. So, but I remember a lot of times sitting there and I would read this book of quotes, among other things. And I remember there was a quote in this, and I think I shared it on here even recently. But the quote said, "What you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying." And that's always stuck with me. Actions speak louder than words, but not to some people. Some people get so fixated on what another person is saying, and it sounds so good to them that they get caught up in the verbiage, in the spoken word, and they don't connect the dots and say, what this person is doing is actually the opposite of what they tell me they're going to do. And this accounts for a lot of the success of communism. In fact, I've shared a story that I remember hearing as a young man about Joseph Stalin. He would, of course, he was the communist dictator in the Soviet Union, the USSR, of which Russia was a part. And he would send people, as communist dictators do, to the gulags, into labor camps. And these individuals would be praising, it's crazy, but they would be praising Stalin, the very person who is ultimately responsible for putting them there. But it's like they never connected those dots. Stalin would say something about, the ideology of communism and how it's from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and people think that sounds so wonderful and all of that, and they miss the fact that because they did something that was not approved by the state, they were in the gulags, even praising in some cases the name of the dictator as they were in these gulags and prisons, praising him for things that, things that he ultimately put them in for, things that he, in the gulag for, things that he never really stood behind, things, these altruistic beliefs that were just words that were spoken or written or whatever that people came to associate with him, but they didn't come to associate their being in prison because of this same individual. So communism requires this kind of disconnect, but at its core, it's a political and an economic ideology that seeks to have a classless society. Classless society. How do they plan to get there? Listen, in my mind, you've heard me say on this program, if you've listened for any length of time, I'm not a person, I don't look at people and think of classes of people. I'm not an idiot. I can look at someone and see that's a man, that's a woman, no matter how much people on the left tell me I can't do that. I can look at someone and see their race or ethnicity. Sometimes you can't, right? You can look at me and see that I'm a shockingly handsome, white-headed dude here on the Todd Huff Show. But you can see a lot of these things, and you can recognize that people are different in a myriad of ways without saying, oh, you're pigeonholed into this class. I really don't like the conversation about middle class, lower middle class, upper middle class. I understand, and there's a reason that we're talking about these sorts of things in politics and all of that. I get it, but I also think that, people, especially in this country, you can shift between economic classes quite easily. I don't want to say easily, but that can happen multiple times in a person's lifetime. In fact, most people who are millionaires or higher, the vast majority of them are first generation. People who embrace this concept of there being a classless society really want you to believe that there's kind of a caste system and there's no way to move between systems and that merit never plays a role. That's simply not the case. That's not the case at all. But that's what people hear. And I think a lot of times people embrace it because they want to make sense of the struggles they've had. Listen, struggle is a part of life. Failure is on the road to success. Too many people, I'm an entrepreneur, and I know my mentality about this has changed a lot since I first became an entrepreneur. I think that there's a phase that most people go through where they're afraid of failing. And so you're extra cautious. You maybe become hyper-perfectionist in your tendencies, and you don't want to make a mistake because you see a mistake as catastrophic. When in reality, you make many decisions a day. You take a projected course, and you'll find along that course there are going to be a series of failures. Failures are feedback from what you're doing. Failures should be viewed as it's just readjusting the GPS, right? It's looking at the coordinates and saying, I need to adjust course. Sometimes they're big failures and I've got to make a massive deviation from the path I'm on. Other times it's just small course corrections. But too many people think that because they've not reached the status that they had hoped to reach economically or whatever, that the only way to fix that is for government to come in and somehow make this right. But that is craziness, because what happens is that you give people in government too much authority, too much power. This is not the way that it is supposed to be. And giving government too much power creates tyranny. Government at its core, at its base level, government is force. And in order to properly have a well, to have a proper understanding of the role of government, which I think our founders nailed perfectly, you first have to understand what is the role, what's the purpose of government, what's the nature of humanity, how are we created to live, what is the best way to get there? And of course, the best way to get there is by having a free society so that people can live their lives according to their own consciences. Of course, there have to be some sort of guardrails that say this is these sorts of things are prohibited because you're directly harming another person, their life, their property, and this is really the framework of how government, of course, built and based upon Western thought, Judean Christian principles. You begin to have some sort of a structure. And you say, we want you to be free. We don't want there to be absolute anarchy. We want there to be an enforcement mechanism so that people cannot act lawlessly and violently against another group of people without some sort of a recourse, prison, punishment, a government that says you can't do that. Of course, government can't protect you from everything, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't try to create a society where people can thrive and live life as they want to live. That's really the balance here. And so we realize that if you look at a continuum, on one end you say there's pure anarchy, on the other end you say you have a complete government top-down control where they make all the decisions, you're just a cog in the wheel, and you do what they tell you. And some people really want that. People want that because they think that's a classless society. That makes us all equal. I don't get, I think this obsession with having equal outcomes, there's such an external focus. Comparison can be such a devastating thing. Why are some people so constantly looking at other people and seeing where they are, and then having jealousy or envy for where that person is, and saying that the reason I'm not there is because they had some benefit that I need to have, and so let's get rid of this, all these classes in society. Let's make it equal so that we can all have, equal outcomes in our life. That's just not the way that it's designed to work. And dare I say, it also will guarantee that you're not going to have as much success in whatever endeavor you choose if you're protected from those failures that we talked about. In fact, the more you travel a path, and listen, I speak as one who's had plenty of failures and things. I would say that the more, once you get past the initial hurt of the failure or of the problem, the more appreciative I think that people are of them. Those people who truly learn from them, that they can be wonderful teachers, wonderful tools. These things can calibrate us so that we get onto the right path. And you eliminate that when you try to say government is responsible for creating all these equal outcomes, a classless society. And to some, this sounds so good. But what you end up doing is you give too much power to the government that's run by human beings just like the rest of us. And we know that the nature of humanity, we're sinful people, my friends. We're not altruistic or just noble creatures. Doesn't mean that we can't do good. It doesn't mean that we often don't choose to do good, but we're not good at our core. And when there's no accountability and when there's too much power, bad things happen. And that's exactly what has happened throughout the course of history when it pertains to communism. It is a wicked, evil ideology. And it sounds so pleasant. It sounds so wonderful to people who want to see things equalized, who want to see things made right, at least in their from their perspective and in their eyes. It sounds so good because these folks have learned to manipulate people into believing that they can actually achieve and accomplish for an entire society what we as individuals should be trying to accomplish for ourselves and for our families. More to say about this, my friends, here as the program unfolds. I want to remind you that we here at the Todd Huff Show opened a division of our business about 6 or 7 months ago called Red, White, and Brand. And we are here to help you put your logo on almost anything. We can help with trade show banners. We can help with promotional products, anything, my friends, apparel that has your logo or your company message on it. You can find out more at redwhiteandbrand.com. That's redwhiteandbrand.com. And if you use my name, Todd, you'll get 10% off your first order. redwhiteandbrand.com, your logo on almost anything, my friends. Okay, so let's go here. Let's dig a little bit deeper here into communism and, of course, Anti-Communism Week, the death of 100 million people approximately in the 20th century. So let's talk a little bit more about communism. I'm going to set this up. I'm going to get as much of this in today as I can as I'm reaching the end of this, the first segment of the program. But we said that communism is a political and economic system that seeks a classless society. They seek to eliminate private property. They want to place all means of production basically in the control of the government. That's where it ends up in practice. In theory, they say it's just collectively owned. We all somehow own everything equally. And there's some wild beliefs. I mean, it's to the point. I mean, I've had conversations, read books, had encounters with people, professors. I mean, it is wild, wild stuff what some of these people believe. You shouldn't have any private property. Some people are even to the point where they say, even spouses or communal, I don't want to say property, but I guess that's how they think about it. Just wild, wild stuff here, my friends. And there's, obviously different, I guess, offshoots of communism and where the line should be drawn. But you get into some really, really crazy stuff. But they want the government to control everything. And the theory promises ultimately equality. But the reality delivers something much, much different. The reality delivers oppression. So you can say that everybody wants equality who's out there spouting these communistic statements and reading these books and saying that they stand. Of course, they usually stand for socialism, which is, listen, socialism might be the off-ramp. Communism, as it's been said, is the destination. These things are related. They're closely related. Make no mistake about it. They'll tell you I'm not a communist. No. I'm a democratic socialist. I think throwing that word democratic in there makes it sound so much better. But the direction of travel and the destination for even democratic socialism is heading in this very direction. Government control of something halfway to communism. So, timeout's in order, my friends. We'll talk more about this after the break. You're listening to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. Talking here about communism. Why are we doing that? Well, number one, it's becoming something that is more prevalent. There are more people today. When I was a kid, if you said you were a communist, I grew up in the 80s. I mean, those were fighting words. You'd probably be in a fist fight if you said you were a communist. I remember a Seinfeld where Elaine was dating a guy named Ned. I think his name was Ned the communist. That was not received well by the audience. I mean, obviously it was a Seinfeld. It was a making fun of this or whatever. But that wasn't something that made someone automatically likable and relatable to the audience or even to the characters on Seinfeld. Of course, I think Kramer found some way. Kramer always found a way to connect with all the characters. But anyway, it's not something that was considered a good thing when I was a kid. And it's not a good thing. It's absolutely not a good thing. It's caused untold havoc and destruction on this planet. It is a dark ideology, my friends, and I'm going to talk more about it. But let me tell you, friends, there's been a lot of confusion out there about kratom. It's like there's confusion about communism. People think it's a good thing. People have been confused out there about kratom because they've seen the headlines. They don't understand that a lot of those headlines are written about things that are not genuine, real, organic kratom. It's often synthetic junk that's not real kratom at all. Real kratom is tested, it's handled with care, it's natural, and that's what you get from Christopher's organic botanicals. Every batch is tested for purity, for safety. There's no chemicals, there's no fillers, there's no shortcuts. This is a trusted herbal option that's been used for generations, and it's a real alternative for people looking for something that doesn't come with some long pharmaceutical warning label. You can start with their Kratom Starter Pack. Use coupon code ToddHuff. You'll get 10% off your first order. But you can also go to their website and just learn. Just learn before you make a purchase. Research and decide for yourself if Kratom is something that makes sense for you and what you're dealing with. Christopher's Organic Botanicals.com. That's the website. Again, Christopher's Organic Botanicals.com. Truth, tradition, transparency. Okay, so let's get here to the roots, I guess, of communism. There was a book written back in 1848 called the Communist Manifesto. I've actually read this a couple of times, written by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. You'll know those names. This is where you get these, I would say, the core ideology, the core belief, which is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That sounds so good to people. And listen, in one sense, I can say that there's something there that's attractive. People who have things, who have been blessed, who have had success. I mean, I've shared on this program that it's a good thing, biblically speaking, to help those who are in difficult circumstances, who are on the on the outskirts, I guess, of the heart of society. People who, Jesus talked about the widows and the orphans and people who were the poor and needy, the sick, commanded us to take care of them. But there wasn't an organized structure that stole from us and then said, we're going to redistribute it. It's really the compassion of individuals and our free choices that are really the means by which we should get there, but not for communism. Communism says, we're going to put the benevolent dictator in charge, and he's going to make all of this right somehow and in some way. So they, in the book, Marx and Engels, called on workers to rise up against capitalism, arguing that private ownership produces inequality. And of course, private ownership does cause there to be different results. I mean, listen, I think about this in terms that the average person would understand. There are 32 National Football League teams, and they create rules. The NFL has rules on trying to make each franchise equally competitive as best they can. But it doesn't work that way. I mean, you have a salary cap. So one team can't go and spend $1 bazillion on the players, and the other team are paying them with IOUs or some such thing, right? That's not the way that it works. They've got a complicated system in place to make sure that teams have the same sorts of resources and tools to get players, attract talent, but nothing is the same. The market in Cleveland is not the same market as Boston, right? And the coaching staff and the different approaches and the players and the culture and all these other things that create different outcomes. There's absolutely nothing that can be done to create a different Super Bowl champion every year, and there's 32 teams. Over the course of the next 32 years, every team wins one Super Bowl. The odds of that happening are practically zero. It's virtually impossible. And you'll notice that some franchises struggle for a lot longer, and others have continually risen to the top. Why? I don't always know why. Sometimes you can tell why. Sometimes there's some good fortune in there. Sometimes there's coaching. Think about the Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't want to make this too much about sports, but the Pittsburgh Steelers have basically had 3 coaches over, I don't know, it went from Chuck Noll to Bill Cowher to Mike Tomlin. And Chuck Noll was coaching, I know, back in the 70s. I think they've had 3 coaches dating back to, you'd have to look it up. I didn't look it up before the program, but it goes back to, say, this 50 years or something like this. They've had 3 coaches. Meanwhile, you'll find other teams who have multiple coaches over a 5-year period of time. And you find yourself saying that, how does that happen? How is the Baltimore Ravens defense every year a good defense? How the Chicago Bears, with some exceptions, even when they're bad, they always seem to have a good defense. How did take your pick, right? There's so many things. And there's no way on earth that there can be equality of outcomes in the NFL, which is only 32 teams. Each team has, 53 players plus the practice squad. We can't even control that. I'm not saying we should try. I'm saying we can't even control that, let alone a nation of 330, 340 million people. It's crazy. And not just in the sport of football, in all aspects of life. Why do people believe this? In a way, you could say it shows that we have a hunger and a thirst for the perfection that we can only have in heaven. You could say that this is, in some way, a bit of evidence, it's a tiny speck of evidence, that says that we were created for something more. It's like we realize maybe that we have the way that things were created to work are not the way that they're working now, which of course goes in line with the biblical narrative of the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. But this is a desire of the human heart, some sort of just almost like a fairy tale storybook ending. And people believe that the government can somehow achieve this. But when this ideology is implemented in the real world, bad things happen. Here's some examples here of just how bad, historically, things have happened in the 20th century alone. In the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin's regimes murdered roughly 20 million of their own people through forced collectivization, execution, the gulags, which I mentioned, and engineered famines. In China, that's Mao Zedong. His great leap forward in cultural revolution killed an estimated 45 to 60 million people through starvation, violence, and political purges. I mean, I guess the mindset is the people who get in the way of the government having absolute control have to be punished or wiped off the face of the planet. That's certainly what it looks like in practice to a person like me. In Cambodia, Pol Pot executed or starved about 2 million people between 1975 and 1979. In North Korea, we know about the Kim dynasty. They have killed or starved millions more through forced labor and purges. Now we've got Kim Jong-un. We had Kim Jong-il previously. Communist governments in Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, the Eastern Bloc added several million more victims through imprisonment, executions, and oppression. That leads us to roughly 100 million people who were killed by communist regimes, by their own government, not by foreign armies. These are not justifiable cases of capital punishment. This is the government saying, we are executing you because you will not submit to our absolute and total authority over you. So, sources for these include the Black Book of Communism, Harvard University Press in 1999, U.S. Congressional Record, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund. So, quick timeout, my friends. Communism kills. That's the core of the message here today. Communism kills, my friends, and we have people that are playing footsie with it here in the United States in 2025. Quick timeout. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. Third and final segment of today's program, talking here about communism since it's Anti-Communism Week, as announced by the White House on this past Friday. Wanted to talk about this because we've had a love affair in this country by some with socialism, which is its cousin. I mean, these are kissing cousins, my friends, communism and socialism, and we'll get to those in a minute. Friends, let's face it, there are a lot of companies out there that don't share our Christian values. The good news is that you do not have to invest in them. At 48 Financial, they specialize in biblically responsible investing. They'll help you screen out companies that go against your faith, your values, and create a plan that's tailored to meet your goals, and they'll handle the heavy lifting for you so you can focus on what really matters. If you want to see how your current investments align with your values, all you have to do is go to 48financial.com/Todd. You can complete a quick assessment there, and you can see to what degree your current investments align with your values. Again, that's 48financial.com/Todd. 48Financial, because our values matter, and friends, so does our money. That leads us back to this talk about communism, socialism. Even with the stats and the information I shared with you just before the break there, people have fallen in love with the maybe a little bit kinder, a little bit gentler relative, the kissing cousin of communism, and that would be socialism. That's made a comeback here in our popular culture today, certainly in academia. And, some people just have a misunderstanding of where this leads, or they don't care, or they think that this time we'll get it right, my friends. This time there won't be the gulags, the starvation, the extreme over-the-top government force. There won't be the calls to make government God. Communism asserts itself as God. Communism says there cannot be, you can't worship God. Now, in the Soviet Union, they quote-unquote allowed there to be churches, but that was more for historical significance. If people were really changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ and thought Jesus and believed Jesus was their king and not the communist dictator, there were consequences to be paid. Just read some of these books. Fox's Book of Martyrs. There's a book called Jesus Freaks that was written, 20-some years ago. And there's stories. There's stories of people who were killed by the communists. I remember some of the. In fact, I remember one story I'll share with you really quickly. There were a group of communist Soviets who went to this community of, I think it was Christians. They were Christians, and they took them out. They stripped them, I believe, naked, or at least barefoot and barely clothed. They took them out on a frozen lake in the middle of winter to basically freeze them to death. They encircled them. They put them out on the frozen lake. And these people, as they were being murdered, frozen to death by these communist evildoers, they started singing worship songs, and they would die one by one. And there's a moving story of one where one of the soldiers, as he was watching this, witnessing this, he stripped down and walked out onto the frozen lake to die alongside these folks. This is the sort of stuff that happens time after time after time. Socialism says, look, government should control the major industries to ensure equality, to protect the workers and all of that. We'll still allow private property. This whole concept. So it's, again, how do you have half tyranny? That's my question. What do you mean you'll still allow some private property? Private property, these things are the gift of Almighty God. This isn't for the government to decide whether people can have private property. These things come to us. Certainly there are rules. You can't go claim someone else's property, but you have the right to own property, to call a place your home. Communism, of course, goes further than that, saying there's no private property at all. Everything is owned and controlled by the state. People applaud this. They think it sounds good. This is where you get from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's what communism says. Some would argue that socialism says from each according to his ability to each according to his work. So you got to work for it still. But again, you're heading in the wrong direction here, my friends. And that's what we have with socialism. Socialism claims to work through democracy. That's where you get this term democratic socialism. But if you continue down this path, it leads to communism. Communism always becomes authoritarian. Always becomes authoritarian. I don't have a lot of time here. I got a lot more thoughts. Milton Friedman once said, a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. And of course, I love quoting Reagan I love quoting Milton Friedman too, but Reagan said this: socialism only works in two places: heaven, where they don't need it, and in hell, where they already have it. And of course, in hell, they have it because there's an equality of absolute suffering. And that, my friends, matters today, because there are people out there, young people and people who are older, but young people who buy into these one-liners, these stated objectives of these ideologies, but they end badly. They end badly. We have to not only educate on the truths of constitutional conservatism and free markets, but we also have to point out the atrocities that are caused by communism, which we did today. I'm out of time, though, my friends. SDG.